Hello boys and girls, today we'll be talking about the upcoming Season 3, which is probably going to be in November, so there's plenty of time until then, and some ideas and changes that could be implemented once it comes to make it much better than Season 2. Now everything that I'm going to mention is mainly going to be from the perspective of a healer and also from the perspective of someone who pugs all of their keys, but some of the ideas actually implement to all levels and all kinds of classes and specs. I would be interested to hear what you think about those and what other ideas you have for possible changes in Season 3, because if something goes viral and very popular, maybe Blizzard will eventually listen and make it happen as a reality. Starting with the very simple ideas, I think it's going to go a long way if they do more buffs and less nerfs inside of the game. One of the best things that happened in Season 2 was the rework of the Holy Paladin, which was basically a huge buff to what it was compared before the rework. And the main reason for that was not giving it more DPS percentage or more healing percentage, instead they gave us a lot of different skills and a lot of different tools to use when healing dungeons. HPS aside, it felt really good to go into a boss fight and have a button to press for every mechanic. At the same time, I would go into those same boss fights on my shaman, on my monk, and I would run out of mana, I would run out of cooldowns, I would run out of buttons, so it felt really bad compared to the paladin. And instead of giving more tools and more buffs to the other healers, they just started nerfing the Holy Paladin, which was probably deserved, different topic. But my whole point here is that nobody felt good about those nerfs. People who switched and who played Holy Paladin of course didn't like that they can do less now, and the other healers didn't get much changes anyway, so it still felt really hard to play in dungeons compared to the Paladins. From my perspective, there was a clear trend when people came back to play the Holy Paladin, and there was a lot of hype about this class when the rework happened. And then later on we saw exactly the opposite behavior when people started quitting, once the nerf started, etc. So that just keeps me wondering what would have happened then. Instead of nerfing the Holy Paladin, they actually gave a little bit more to the other healers and created a hype for people to come back and, let's say, play a shaman or a monk or something like that. Maybe the season would turn out in quite a different way. And that brings me to my second point. They need to do a better job testing and tuning everything, because the Holy Paladin got about 25 to 30% nerfs since that reworks. And if you're missing your mark with so much, more than a quarter, then as harsh as it sounds, you simply just need to do a better job. It's very discouraging to see that the class you're playing is getting nerfed. Most people just don't have the time to start playing another class. And this is exactly what happened to, let's say, Fire Mages, Preservation Evoker last year, Holy Paladin, and the list goes on and on. Unfortunately, that doesn't apply only to classes, because many of the dungeons, when they were released at the beginning of the season, were extremely hard. Some of the boss fights were actually unplayable, and the beginning of the season is when people actually come back and play the game. So if they go into those initial states of the dungeon and they see how hard they are, they simply do not come back. Eventually, all of those pain points were nerfed, and now the dungeons are in fact in a playable state. But if you didn't wait long enough for this to happen, then you're simply not here right now. And some of the changes and the nerfs took months to actually get into the game. At the same time, there were some really cool designed fights and boss mechanics, but they were also very hard to execute in bugs. I'm sure that organized groups had a blast this season, but for bugs, let's say if you go into Udaman, you're relying on having people who can dispel the bleed on the third boss, or you're hoping that people pick the right talents to get the time sync debuff off from the last boss, because if they don't, those things simply become unhealable at higher key levels. And there are many more examples like this in the current dungeon pool. I'm actually making a separate video talking about this, so stay tuned and check the channel later on. But there were some pretty cool designs last season that were basically separating DPS and healer checks from each other. And they didn't make it mandatory for you to have, let's say, a Shadow Priest on your group or an Evoker to dispel some bleed or something like that. For example, if you take Shadow Moon Burial Grounds, there were some pretty cool DPS checks there where you go into a Shadow Realm and have to kill a Nat. If you don't kill a Nat, obviously it's your own fault, it's not the healer's fault. Or the Wall of Death on the last boss, where the DPS had to make a hole in the wall so everybody can pass through. While at the same time you had things like the Raging Tempest, which were very good healer checks, and etc. So in general, apart from testing and tuning better, I think it's going to make a huge difference if they design the dungeons in a little bit easier to handle way for bugs. I don't have information what's the ratio between people who play an organized group versus pugs. Apparently I'm one from the latter group, but I think that there's a lot of people who would benefit from the dungeons being a little bit easier on that regard, and the organized teams are still going to have fun playing those dungeons nevertheless. And in that same direction, I really hate when I see mechanics in the dungeon that require you to have a specific class or a healer. If you need a second Despair or a second Decurse, or if there is a certain poison or disease that the healer cannot dispel, that automatically makes this the most hated dungeons for those people who basically have to rely on somebody else being in the party so you can actually handle the mechanics. And that also goes back to the design better part of things. Now let's go to some of the more crazy ideas, because one of the main points in this season was that the augmentation evoker is now basically required in every high key. Nobody is going to go run a plus 22 without actually having one in group. There are exceptions of course, but it feels now that there is a guaranteed spot for that support role, which means that there's only 2 DPS spots left for everybody else to fill in. But there was that crazy idea to make the dungeons actually now 6-manable instead of the regular 5-man groups that we are used to. Now that's an interesting idea, because then one of the spots is going to be basically reserved for the support class, and that also probably means that we're going to need more support classes inside of the game, so maybe the time is not ripe for this. Although you could easily go with 4 DPS instead of 3 DPS and a support class. And as interesting as that sounds, I'm kinda opposed to this idea, simply because the tuning is not going to be a problem. It will be easy to scale all the DPS and HPS checks for 6 people, but I'm afraid that they're going to change the layout of the dungeons entirely. There's going to be bigger packs with more interrupts, which means that there will be less space for mistakes in pug groups, because it's even hard now to communicate and coordinate all the kicks and all the interrupts, and if you have one more person, which means there's going to be additional kicks and interrupts for that person, it's going to be even harder. Again, this is something that probably organized groups are not going to be having problems with. It's going to be better for them and they will have no problem finding additional 6th person, but for pugs, the more variables you have, the more chances you have somebody to mess up, the harder the key becomes. So my concern here is that one additional person in the group is going to make the pugs exponentially harder, and I don't think they need that at this point. I think they're hard enough as they are right now. However, this is a very interesting idea, and I'm very interested to find out what do you guys think about this. Do you think a 6th person is the solution to this evoker problem, or do you think it's something else? Because if they tune down the class a lot, then probably nobody's going to play it. They'll prefer a 3rd DPS spot, and if they keep it at its current state, it basically has a guaranteed spot in the M+ scene. I'm pretty sure Blizzard is also looking for some good solutions to this problem, so if you have any bright ideas, please feel free to share them in the comments below. Next on the list, we have to mention the affixes. They made some changes this season. There's no seasonal affix, which I think is great. Because if the seasonal affix was good, you had a blast of a season, but if it was bad, like Thundering, then you would not enjoy the entire season based on the affix itself. They did remove some of the nasty ones, but the new ones that they introduced had some problems as well. A lot of people complained about the Afflicted, which is kinda okay for me, the Incorporeal, which I hate with passion. And I think that those affixes are not that bad, and they could actually be made as a relatively good affixes with a little redesign and a little bit more work. The two main problems that I see with them is that first, they require you to change your talents for the entire week to have something to deal with them. I often ended up in situations where people simply didn't do that, or they forgot to do it and the whole key was bricked because of that. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Blizzard basically didn't want you to change talents before every boss fight and between trash and boss pools. But I guess it's fine for them for you to change talents before every dungeon and then every week based on the affixes. That is just too cringe for me. So I think whatever skill or ability you need to handle for the affixes, it needs to be based so you don't have to change your talent tree every week and then you forget about it or you forget to switch out of it, and that only brings more problems to dungeons. And the other big problem with that is that some people refuse to handle the affixes and you have to either do it alone, or let's say in the case of Incorporeal you overlap and although you did everything correctly, it still goes off and it wipes you. So in my opinion, if they make those affixes personal, they're going to get away with a lot of the troubles that are in the game because of those affixes right now. What if the affix actually spawns on top of you and you're the only one who can see it? you then have no excuse not to press the button that you're supposed to press, no matter if it's supposed to be a CC or the spell. This will also solve the problem of the affixes spawning in some very unpleasant and inconvenient places, and also if it goes off, you'll be the only one who's punished and it's not going to wipe the entire group. So I think that small changes like that could actually keep those affixes in the game, but make it so that they're not so dangerous for the whole group, and they'll make basically everyone engaged, but without adding that additional argument, oh, this is your job, not mine, you do it. And speaking about crazy ideas, I have one more which is also going to make the affixes a little bit different. What if Blizzard actually allows you to do your own Keystone with your own affixes? This is actually already in-game because this is exactly what happens on Test and Tournament Realms, and I think that this is going to offer a little bit of different gameplay and it's going to solve some of the problems in the game right now. First, if you don't like a certain affix, you basically won't have to play it at all if that is your decision. And then there are a lot of people who would basically skip either tyrannical weeks because they're too hard, or weeks that have that affix that they don't want to play at all. Personally, I also have the opposite effect. There is a push week that I want to push keys at, but I'm very busy, I can't play the game that much. During that time, I miss the opportunity to push my keys higher, and then the next week is actually with some bad affixes and I don't play the game that much anyway. And then in order to keep the variety in the game, they could implement a bunch of mechanics that will incentivize you to play different affixes instead of picking the two easiest ones all the time. That could be extra loot for certain set of affixes, it could be a little bit of an extra score, or it could be just an achievement to finish every dungeon with every different set of affixes at a certain key level. Or even something as crazy as, let's say this is the set of affixes that's important this week, if you finish all the dungeons at certain key level with those affixes, you can now pick a slot in the Great Vault that is going to guarantee you a piece on a certain slot. Or you can get tokens like the diners in the last tier expansion, which is going to be tradable for a specific item that you couldn't get so far in the season, which is going to solve another big problem with spamming the same dungeon over and over again to get a piece of gear, or hoping that the Great Vault RNG is going to be pleasant for you this specific week. So yeah, having the opportunity to do your own Keystone with your own affixes is probably going to be a little bit of opening the Pandora's box, but if you do it correctly, it is going to add additional layer to the game and make it much more interesting, whether if it's just after a certain Keystone level or whether or not they're going to allow you to do, let's say, Fortified and Tyrannical at the same time. Maybe I'm crazy, but I am a believer that giving the freedom to people to do whatever they like is going to actually be beneficial in the long term. So those are basically the ideas that I have for next season. What are your ideas? What would you like to see in the game? What is going to make it better for you to play and participate, whether if it's on M+, raid, or something else? I would personally love it if they unlock Mythic raiding to groups that are not 20 but less, because simply we don't have that many people to Mythic raid right now, and I would love to do that. But that's just probably just another Pandora's box. Anyhow, thanks for watching. I would be very interested to find out what you think about those ideas or what you're on in the comments below. I'll see you in the next video. Until then, good luck and happy keying. Take care.